Alright, so we've been talking a little bit about the Civil War. We discussed slavery. We talked about abolitionists, who are people who are trying to get rid of slavery. You guys started a timeline, looked at the Missouri Compromise, and looked at differences between the North and the South. So we're going to continue on with the theme of the Civil War and look at some causes that caused the Civil War. There wasn't one major event that caused the Civil War, more like a string of events that all compounded upon each other to cause the Civil War to happen. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Missouri Compromise, which you guys already created the map for. So before the Missouri Compromise, there was an equal number of slave states here in orange and an equal number of free states here in green. Missouri was not a state. Maine was not a state. Missouri wanted to enter the Union and become a state, which would have made it so that slave states had more power in the Senate. But remember, when we talked about preventing tyranny, they wanted each state to have the same amount of power. Well, that concept rolls over to slave and free states. They wanted there to be balance of power between slave states and free states. So what they said is, Missouri can come in as a state, and Maine is going to come in as a state. So 2 new states were added. The other deal that came up was that any state that was created above the 3630 line, which goes across the United States, splits California in half, anything that was created above the 3630 line were supposed to be free. And this compromise was accepted, and slave states and free states are balanced. Well then, some 20 years later, we have the Compromise of 1850. You need to know these 5 statements about the Compromise of 1850. You need to know these 5 statements about the Compromise of 1850. You need to know these 5 statements about the Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay, who's right here in this picture, was a senator, and he proposed a compromise that did 5 things. It made California a completely free state. The Mexican cession lands, which would have been Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of Colorado, parts of New Mexico, were now open to the possibility of slavery. Texas had to return the New Mexico lands to the government. Slave trade in D.C. was abolished, and Congress would pass a stronger fugitive slave law. So here they're saying slavery is bad. Here slavery is okay. Here they can have slavery once New Mexico is given back to the government. Here slavery in the nation's capital is finally abolished in 1850. So almost 100 years after the nation's created. So here slavery is bad. But then here, number 5, they're like, okay, well, slavery's bad, I guess. But if your slave runs away, we'll send him back to you. And so some use this to argue that the North really wasn't against slavery, but more about appeasing the South and giving the South what they wanted. So then comes this concept of popular sovereignty. It started gaining steam in 1848. Basically, it challenges what was laid out in the Missouri Compromise, which said everything above the 3630 line is free. And people who wanted popular sovereignty said that the territories should get to decide if there was slavery or not. And so conflict was reignited, and it carries through to the election of 1860. So a whole 12 years later, this battle is still going on. So then we get the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it gets rid of the Missouri Compromise. And it says that Kansas and Nebraska, territories right here and right here, created above the 3630 line, mind you, would get to decide if slavery would be allowed in their territory. So they successfully implemented a policy of popular sovereignty, and pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates rushed both territories so that they could vote to decide if there would be slavery in each of those territories. So then enters one of my favorite abolitionists, John Brown. John Brown is crazy, as seen in this picture. Him and his sons lived in Kansas, and when pro-slavery people came into their state, he attacked them, and him and his sons were involved in many skirmishes and battles where they killed people over this slavery battle. John Brown was not the only person to do this. Many people in the territory fought and died for slavery. But John Brown is crazy because then, after all the Bleeding Kansas and stuff happens, in 1859, so the year before the Civil War starts, John Brown decides to lead an attack on a federal arsenal. And what that is it's a military base that holds weapons. So John Brown and his sons rally all these people together, and they go attack a military base and try and steal military weapons so that they can give them to slaves and later revolt. Well, John Brown failed miserably. He attacked this place called Harper's Ferry, which is in Virginia, which is in the South. And Robert E. Lee found Brown because he raided a military base, and took him into custody, and then they eventually killed him, and he became a martyr for slavery. A martyr is someone who stands up or dies for a cause they believe in, and John Brown believed that slavery should not happen in the United States, and he was willing to and eventually did die for it. So we know that slavery was expanding because of the cotton gin. They needed more slaves to pick more cotton to grow, so they could seed more cotton to sell to the North. Southern states wanted new states who were admitted to the Union. The Southern states wanted them to have slavery, and the Northern states wanted these new states to remain free. So there's this battle between the Northern states and the Southern states. Nobody is saying get rid of slavery in the South, but that's how the South felt. They felt attacked, and they felt like their way of life was being challenged. So in comes the presidential election for the year 1860. That's when that's when the election is going to take place. You have Abraham Lincoln, you have Stephen Douglas. Republican is Lincoln, Democrat is Douglas. We'll get to the other Democrat later. They debated about slavery, and Lincoln pretty much said, look, I don't want slavery expanding, but I'm not going to take slavery away. And Stephen Douglas was like, no, we need slavery. So two opposing viewpoints. Lincoln looked very disheveled, very homely. He spoke with a lighter voice. You couldn't really hear him or understand him. Stephen Douglas was polished, well put together, spoke steadily, knew how to work the crowd, essentially. And some people say that Lincoln actually lost the debate because he didn't really sound like he knew what he was talking about. So enter the election. There's 4 candidates. You have Abraham Lincoln, the Republican, Stephen Douglas, a Democrat, John Breckinridge, a Democrat, and John Bell, who's Constitutional Union, which is like independent. Note that the Democrat Party is split, and historically, if a party splits and has 2 candidates running, the other party will win. So in this election, you have 2 Democrats, a Northern Democrat and a Southern Democrat, and so the Democrat vote is split, and Lincoln wins, the Republican wins. If you look at the results from the election of 1860, which we will, if you add the Democrat votes together, they could have beat Lincoln, but because they split, they lost. This also happened in our most recent election. The Democratic vote was split again, and the Republican won. So the vote was split between 4 candidates. Lincoln won the election, and the South almost immediately left the Union. So remember I said Lincoln did not want slavery to take place, or he didn't want slavery to expand, but he was okay with slavery where it was. Well, the South felt threatened, and so they decided to just leave the United States because they didn't want their way of life to change because of Lincoln. Okay, so a lot of that was political stuff. The case of Dred Scott is more of a social issue. So Scott was a slave. He was an enslaved human taken to a free state by his master. And because the territory didn't have slavery, Scott felt he was free. So he sued. The court case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Scott got up there, made his case, said, look, my master took me to a free state or free territory. I should be free. I should no longer be a slave. And the Supreme Court said blacks had no rights. They were inferior and could not sue in court. So because Scott was black, he was unable to sue, which means his court case got denied, which means he was sent back to slavery. Okay. Then we have Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a little white lady, and she wrote articles for a newspaper about slavery, and then someone convinced her to write a book. Well, Harriet Beecher Stowe had no experience with slavery. She just had the stories of her friends and what she had heard. The way she wrote the book made slavery sound so terrible that the North became very outraged. So the North is now anti-slavery. A lot more people were anti-slavery than they were before. And she got to meet President Lincoln, and Lincoln allegedly made the statement that he told her, so you're the little lady that started this great big war. He felt that because there was so much animosity towards slavery in the North that was caused by this book, that it was her fault that the war started. All right. So you have a quiz this Thursday. You need to make sure that you know about these causes. There will be a list of the causes and a statement you will have to match on your quiz. So please make sure you know the causes for your quiz on Thursday.